What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Ascent, a Cyberpunk ARPG with a lot of very fast-paced combat. However, before we dive into all that, a few things I have to get out of the way at the beginning here. For starters, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that I cover, there's a link to a video in the description below that explains everything. If you're not subscribed and go to my channel, it's also the first video that you'll see. And lastly, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. I also want to tell you here at the beginning that I did get this game for free, however, it was not from the publisher or the developer or anything. Last December, there was an isometric sale on a bunch of isometric games, and I received it for free as a part of that event, along with like 50 other game codes to give away to various people as part of the holidays. As previously mentioned, this game is a Cyberpunk ARPG with pretty fast-paced and I would say almost frantic combat at times that launched back in 2021 originally, with the game receiving pretty general praise, especially for its looks and the world itself, while many people complaining of a lot of technical problems. Now, on the technical side of things, I can say that I personally did not have any issues with the game, though I have seen some reports of people still struggling with it on console at times. On PC, especially Steam, I had zero issues, so it seems a lot of those initial launch pains have mostly been ironed out. Though, while we're on the subject, the game does offer a variety of both graphical options to adjust things if you're having trouble running this one, as the world of this game is pretty intense on systems. But in addition to that, we also have a suite of accessibility options that include a lot of colorblind modes that might help you play through the game if you're having trouble parsing everything going on screen, as the lighting and the color is pretty intense. But with all of that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive into this and start talking about the game itself a little bit. We play as an indent, or an indentured servant to a corporation. Much like all cyberpunk settings really, there are mega corporations that control basically everything. We are on a planet known as Velis, working for a company called the Ascent Group. Shortly after the beginning of the game, with us doing menial labor to get by, the Ascent Group goes bankrupt, and much of the story revolves around the why this happened, as giant corporations do not typically just go under, seemingly at random, but also simply trying to survive in a pretty cruel cyberpunk world where life is frankly pretty cheap. Though I will say the story does go on to do a lot more than that, and I would say for an ARPG, it's pretty solid. These types of games aren't typically known for their amazing stories, as the story is usually just a vehicle to the carnage. But in the case of the Ascent, the story is decent. It does go a few places, has some cool stuff going on. I wouldn't say it's super memorable. It's probably not something that's going to stick out as amazing or anything, but generally speaking, I enjoyed the story, which is about as much detail as I can give you without full-on spoiling it, as the game is relatively short. If you're just blasting through the main story, you're looking at probably 10 hours. With this being a very short game to 100%, it only took me about 22 hours roughly to do so. Though the game does have a decent amount of side content, as despite this being an ARPG, you are given more or less free reign to explore and run around as far as your abilities can take you, outside of a few areas that are locked off as part of the story. But generally speaking, you are free to roam around the rather extensive layouts of various levels of the arcology, as they call it, or the giant cyberpunk building that you are in. But even still, the game is relatively short. However, you can play through the main story and all of its side content, etc. with a friend, as the game supports both local and online co-op, which is certainly a great option for games like this, as I do think it plays very well with another person, because what the story fails to do, and much of the side content as well, is provide a lot of, say, choice and consequence, which you generally wouldn't expect from a game like this. But I just couldn't help feeling like it really would have been at home here, because unfortunately the combat isn't that amazing either, which we'll get into shortly. First, we are going to talk character creation. You do get to create a character to an extent. This is just cosmetic though, and keep in mind this is an isometric game, so you're not going to see a ton of your character, or at least a good view. But nonetheless, you can create your character, set a few major colors, and get an appropriately cyberpunked character going for the game. In addition to this, this, while equipment will modify your appearance, there is a sort of transmogrification vendor available that can set your armor to all of the available ones that you've found, etc. So you can customize your look quite a bit, which includes resetting your actual appearance later on should you so choose as well. But character creation is pretty much just cosmetic, unlike our actual character progression. Now, both the progression systems and the combat in this game are not super in-depth. Most of the systems are relatively simple, which is probably good for a game to jump into and play with your friend for a short time. But to break some of this stuff down, as your character gains levels, you'll gain 3 skill points per level to put into 8 different stats. Each of these stats controls a specific part of the combat generally, either your tactical or your sort of ultimate recharge rate, or say weapon reloading or the spread on a various weapon, alongside augmenting your actual usable abilities as well. Most of them scale off of these attributes, and putting points into one of these particular stats will actually raise your 4 attributes, making you that much better in combat. Each stat can be given a maximum of 20 points, and while this might seem like an initial take on build diversity, reality is you'll get to max most of these out. Just from playing the game and doing all the content from the base game as well as the DLC is going to put you at around level 35, and given that you can also find extra skill points just from exploring the world, you can easily max 6 of these 8 stats out just by playing through the game's normal content without grinding at all. You can then keep going and leveling up more and potentially maxing out the other 2, though that would take a while. Now, the other forms of progression are primarily down to your equipment, both the equipment you're wearing as well as your weapons. The equipment you're wearing is relatively simple. These will give you resistances to various damage types, as well as a potential boost to some of your attributes or your stats. Your weapons, on the other hand, are a little bit more complicated, as each weapon is somewhat unique in the way it fires, the amount of rounds in its magazine, etc. Plus, one of the things you can find from doing all your exploring is components. Components can be used to upgrade various weapons. They can be upgraded to a maximum of Mark 10, which will typically give you more damage, of course, to keep that weapon relevant. And because of this very simple, rather straightforward progression, it's very much so possible to become a sort of jack of all trades where you can pretty much use the weapons you want, the gear you want, the abilities you want. So while you will be making a sort of loadout for yourself, you can change it very freely, which leads to a sort of jack of all trades playstyle, which then brings us to the world and the gameplay itself. So the world of the Ascent is easily the best part of it. It is stunning, especially with all of the graphical settings turned to max, the ray tracing on, which is what you're seeing on screen here, putting my new 4090 to some actual work, but the game looks incredible. The world feels alive. There's people everywhere. They'll generally react to all the fighting going around. Many of the enemies won't necessarily be hostile right away, but rather when you walk into their territory, they'll eventually turn hostile. And then there's just the sheer amount of detail on every little thing. The world that they've built here and the setting is just incredible to look at. And as I mentioned, you're mostly free to explore it. While there are a couple of sort of hub areas where you can do a lot of your in-town stuff, like handling all your gear, that kind of thing, you're mostly free to roam as you please. Provided, of course, you can fight your way through the potential masses to do just that, which runs into a couple of problems. Now, on the bright side, there is plenty of fast travel available to you, so while the explorable levels are quite large, you can either take the train various places, which is free, or you can call a taxi, which will charge you a small amount of currency to directly drop you off to a place you've explored previously, making getting around relatively quick. However, in spite of that, you will be retreading old ground quite a bit, especially if you're trying to do the side quests. Though personally, I found that I didn't really care too much about this until the very end of the game, as everything was just really cool to look at, but eventually you do get to a point where it starts to wear a little thin. But nonetheless, exploring, doing all the side quests, that kind of thing can reward you with skill points, extra gear you might not normally have, or components to upgrade your weapons with. Or perhaps most interestingly, cyber deck upgrades. Every character has a cyber deck associated with them, and it is upgradable, meaning it will allow you to hack into more stuff the more upgrades you find, which will allow you to get better and better loot, such as those skill points, the gear, etc. And this adds just a little bit bit of interactivity to the world that is otherwise kind of lacking. Though you can use the hacking to do more than just interact with the environment, although there is plenty of that, such as hacking vending machines for health pickups, doors, chests, etc. You can also hack your enemies, which can stun them or deal a little bit of damage even, or do other useful things. So again, just a little bit of interactivity there. Now, my one complaint about the world really is that the layout of some of the enemies can be frustrating in the early game, because oftentimes the main quest or side quest will be sending you to a level appropriate objective. However, if you're not careful or you stray off the beaten path, you might just get one shot by an enemy 10 levels higher than you because they are so closely grouped together. And while this is an issue that obviously goes away after a while, it can be pretty frustrating the first few times it happens, as you go from exploring and having a good time doing a level appropriate thing, only to get domed by a one shot just as you turn a corner. So, you know, there's some good and some bad there. But all of that finally brings us to the combat, which we will be doing a lot of. And again, it's fun, it's fast paced. However, I do think it gets stale relatively quickly because the game shows you much of what it has going on very, very fast. So for starters, you're going to be doing a lot of shooting. There is melee weapons available later in the DLC portion, which is after the main campaign, but most of what you're going to be doing is shooting. You can shoot high and low, which is important because there is a cover system at play. If you are behind cover by crouching, which can also be used to navigate the environment a little bit, you can raise your weapon up, shoot high, shoot over cover, shoot enemies that are larger, etc. Some enemies are smaller, and if you shoot high, you'll shoot over them, or the enemy might be using cover, and so there's a little bit of interplay there just with that. But then we have our weapons, our abilities, and our tactical. Now, weapons come in all shapes and sizes, really. There are shotguns, grenade launchers, submachine guns, pistols, assault rifles, as well as a variety of special weapons. Personally, one of my favorite that I found very late in the game was a sort of Gatling gun shotgun, which made zero sense, but it was very fun to use. And my point being, you're likely to find something that suits you, though things like the reload time, etc. will be affected by your stats. In addition to that, though, you also have two active abilities, which act as your sort of cyberware. These typically scale off of an attribute, so theoretically you want to use ones that scale off of what you are using, at least in the early game. These are powerful abilities that usually cost energy. Energy recovers over time, so not unlike mana, but basically it keeps you from spamming these abilities. These can do a variety of fun things, but some of my favorites actually summon things onto the battlefield in the later game, where you can just summon mechs in to aid you, one of which just turns you immune while you're in it, and you actually get to pilot it around, and I found that very helpful when combat turned into a bit of a bullet hell later, though that one is technically a tactical ability. Tacticals are sort of like your ultimates. They recharge over time as you're shooting and interacting with things, and they tend to change the scope of the battlefield quite a bit when they're used. Again, the summon mech one is probably my favorite, but there are others such as a stasis grenade that will stun all enemies, and you can sort of turn them into a living bomb by pumping them full of damage that then explodes afterwards. There's also just actual grenades, EMPs, things like that. So all of that together combines to give you a variety of options to tackle this combat with, which forms your loadout. But you can change this freely at pretty much any given time, which means you're likely going to be hot swapping between this stuff pretty regularly, and there's no way to really specialize in anything, which leads to a combat system that is relatively simple after the first few hours, even if it is very fun. Now, beyond just the technical stuff though, the gameplay feels great, like shooting and running and gunning feels awesome, which is what makes me crave more of it. Unfortunately, the game just doesn't have more to give. Though into the late game, you'll often be fighting just tons of enemies all at the same time. There will be shooting going on everywhere, and it can be a little hard to keep track of, especially when you start taking into account cover, shooting high and low, all your various abilities, etc. And this gets cranked up to 11 in the DLC. And while this can definitely lead to some pretty big difficulty spikes, especially with certain bosses, changing your loadout and your approach will typically get it sorted out for you. But more than anything, the combat is really, really fun, which is why I was disappointed that there just wasn't more of it. And as I mentioned back in the story section, there's also not a lot of choice or big RPG elements outside of just performing linear quests. And this is where it becomes pretty apparent that despite the game looking amazing and playing amazing, it's definitely more of a AA scope, But more on that here in a little bit. First up, I want to talk about the DLC. Outside of a few cosmetic DLCs, there is one big content DLC for the Ascent called Cyber Heist, and it takes place post-campaign. Once you reach this point in the game, it will unlock a brand new area with new enemies and all sorts of stuff to play around with. As I mentioned, the game really cranks the combat up to 11 here. There is just so much going on. Oftentimes, just moving from place to place in the DLC can be a little rough because there's so much combat going on. If you're even a little underleveled, you might have a problem. The game does also introduce some new stuff here, such as melee weapons. You'll be able to get yourself either a giant hammer or a katana, which will have special melee moves and usually deal a ton of damage, but require you to, of course, get close to enemies to use. So there's a lot of fun interplay here, and especially after playing through the game with the regular weapons, getting a hold of the melee stuff is a lot of fun. The story behind the DLC is also compelling enough, with some pretty cool fights here and there. It is ultimately a bit vague as to what is actually going on. I don't think I could spoil this for you if I really wanted to, but mostly the DLC is just a little bit more of the same, which certainly isn't a bad thing. That, though, brings us to our Steam Deck section of the video, and officially the game has a verified rating on the Steam Deck, which I would say mostly checks out, with a few things I want to note. Personally, I struggle to play games like this with a controller, as mouse and keyboard is the way to go here for me, but it does have full controller support, cloud saves, all that usual stuff, though it will save the settings from your PC, which means you're going to have to turn that down if you're going back and forth, as the Steam Deck is really only going to be able to handle this thing on like medium or lower. And then I had one very specific issue with the game, which was very odd, and that is that the main menu for this particular game on Steam Deck does not have an exit game button. At first, I thought I might just be missing it, so I looked it up, and no, it's not just me. This game does not have an exit game button on its main menu on the Steam Deck, which means you either have to use the Steam button, or if you're on desktop, use the force quit command, which on the Steam Deck is a little difficult. You have to hold Steam and B on the Steam Deck down, which is just a bizarre little thing to have, but nonetheless, thought I would mention it. Otherwise, it plays great once you get used to the controls. Just remember to change your settings. That, though, brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up with a conclusion. Now, on the positive side of things, we have the gameplay itself and the world. The gameplay of this game is very, very smooth. The actual shooting, the mechanics, the skill ceiling that you slowly learn and adapt to is a ton of fun to engage with. And it's a shame that the systems aren't more in depth to support that, because the minute to minute of it is a blast. And you get to do that while moving through a stunning cyberpunk world. The world in this game is truly remarkable. The level of detail here is just something else. And on top of just looking great, it feels lived in. Things are moving and changing as you play the game, and it's really remarkable. Now, on the negative side of things, it's mostly just a lack of depth, really. There's not a ton of depth to the combat system. There's not a ton of depth to the character progression. And I would say that's my biggest issue with the game. For all the fun that I had with it, I couldn't help but wishing there was more, which, of the negatives to have is not the worst thing in the world. But beyond just that, even, we also have issues with the enemy layout that I mentioned. Sometimes high-level enemies are right next to low-level enemies that you're supposed to be fighting, which can cause some problems. There are also huge difficulty spikes here and there that don't seem to really make any sense, and can turn especially the later parts of the game into a bit of a slog, especially with enemies spawning seemingly out of nowhere, turning it into a bit of a bullet hell. All of that, though, brings me to my conclusion. My conclusion for the Ascent is this. This game is good, but unfortunately it's not great, and it is frustratingly close to being great, and that's why it makes for such an interesting game to talk about, because while I enjoyed the Ascent, and I do think you should play it. It is $30 on Steam full price. The DLC is $10. I think for what you're getting, that's a very good price. However, at this point, with it being a couple years old, you can also find it on sale regularly. But in spite of recommending that you buy it, more than anything, this game is, again, just so close to being truly great. And with this being a relatively small team, I could have seen that going one of two ways. Either they went more in on the combat, added build diversity, made the ARPG RPG aspects more engaging, or they took it the other direction and made the RPG elements more interesting. You have this incredible world, let's see more of it, let's add some choice and consequence. They could have done either of those things, and they're really close to both of them, but they failed to deliver on each of those things on a substantial level. And again, that doesn't make the game any less good, but that's what's stopping it from being great. So with that in mind, I sincerely hope that Neon Giant, the developer, doesn't stop here. They could take this style of game and again do either of those things, either go all in on the ARPG aspects or make a full-blown RPG out of it, as what they've made here is especially impressive, and if they take what they've got here and just go a little bit farther with it, I think they would absolutely knock it out of the park. But as it stands, the Ascent is pretty good. There are things I enjoyed about it, even if it does get a little stale after a while. It is nonetheless very fun. So in spite of all of that, I would absolutely still recommend you buy the Ascent. The price is pretty reasonable given what you're getting, and with it being a couple years old, you can always find it on sale. That is everything I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. And by all means, let me know how you feel about the title down in the comment section below. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. I truly do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.